when a warlord who bends the flow of history itself tears through the fabric of space above a shattered world, even the mightiest powers in the galaxy must ask themselves a single, terrible question. A Mandalorian leader watches her people's past begin to unravel, erased moment by moment, while a Sith Lord discovers that his mastery of the Force means nothing against an enemy who exists outside time's rules entirely. Technology that can rewrite destiny, armor that cannot be scratched by any blade, and a conqueror who has already seen every way this war could end. But can a man who controls infinite possibilities truly understand a culture that refuses to die no matter how many times history tries to kill them? And when the past itself becomes a battlefield, who decides which version of the galaxy gets to survive? The planet Mandalore had known fire before. It had known the scorch of orbital bombardment, the ash choke of clan wars, the slow death of ecological collapse. Its surface still wore the scars like ceremonial armor, domed cities rising from cratered wastes where once forests had flourished. The Mandalorians, who walked those ruined lands, carried the memory of better days in their beskar, metal passed down through generations, each dent a story, each scratch a name. They were a people forged by loss, tempered by survival, their creed as unyielding as the iron they wore. But nothing in Mandalore's long history of devastation had prepared them for the rupture. It opened above the polar ice fields at dawn, a wound in the sky itself. Not the swirling blue of hyperspace emergence, not the violent tear of a superweapon. This was something older and more wrong, a fissure that bled colors the eye couldn't hold, geometries that shifted between angles that shouldn't exist. The rupture pulsed with light that seemed to move backward through time, casting shadows before the objects that made them. The ice below fractured in sympathetic patterns, crystalline structures shattering along lines of temporal instability. The sensors in Sundari went mad first. Every chrono synchronized to Coruscant standard flickered through decades in seconds. Navigation systems plotted courses through star charts that hadn't existed for millennia, then updated to configurations centuries hence. In the throne room of the royal palace, Bo-Katan Kryze watched her tactical displays rewrite themselves, fleet positions shifting through past deployments and future formations that might never come to pass. She stood before the viewport, her red and gray armor catching the amber light of Mandalore's wounded sun. Her face, unhelmed, bore the sharp angles of leadership and the deeper lines of doubt. The darksaber hung at her hip, its ancient blade dark and dormant, a symbol of authority she wore like penance. Around her, Mandalorian warriors spoke in urgent bursts over comms, their voices tight with discipline barely containing alarm. All clans report temporal distortions across the northern hemisphere. Her second, Koska Reeves, announced from the command station. Equipment failures, memory fragmentations. 3 scouts near the rupture claim to have seen themselves hours from now, already dead. Bo-Katan's jaw tightened. She had rebuilt Mandalore from imperial ashes, gathered the scattered clans, forged unity from ancestral feuds. She had earned the Darksaber not through ancient ritual but through blood and conviction, and still some questioned whether she deserved to carry it. The weight of that doubt was a stone in her chest, cold and constant. And now this. "Prep my ship," she said. "Full squadron. If something's coming through that rupture, I want to see it with my own eyes before it reaches Sundari." The Fang fighters launched in perfect formation, their angular hulls slicing through Mandalore's thin atmosphere. Bo-Katan piloted the lead craft, her gloved hands steady on the controls, despite the readings that made no sense. Her sensors detected mass where there was only sky, energy signatures that predated the Republic, gravitational distortions that suggested the presence of a moon where no moon had ever been. The rupture grew larger as they approached, a vertical gash in reality itself, its edges writhing with temporal discharge. Through her cockpit canopy, Bo-Katan saw light bend around it in impossible curves, photons arriving before they departed, causality eating its own tail. Then something emerged. The ship that came through defied classification. It was neither organic nor entirely mechanical, its hull constructed from materials that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Sections phased in and out of visibility, quantum-locked plates shifting through configurations that suggested the craft was its own ancestor and descendant. The vessel's architecture borrowed from 1,000 civilizations across 1,000 eras, each design element stolen from a conquered timeline and grafted into a whole that should not function but did. It was colossal, larger than a star destroyer, yet moving with the precision of a starfighter. Weapons bristled along its flanks, cannons whose barrels extended into dimensions the eye couldn't follow. At its heart, visible through gaps in the phasing armor, burned something that resembled a star compressed to the size of a fist, energy bleeding from its surface in waves that made Bo-Katan's instruments scream. The ship hung in Mandalore's sky like a judgment. Bo-Katan keyed her squadron channel. Hold formation. Weapons hot, but do not engage. I want to know what we're dealing with. A voice answered her. Not through comms, but through every speaker in her cockpit simultaneously, through the hull itself, through the metal of her armor and the bones of her skull. It was a man's voice, cultured and cold, tinged with amusement that carried the weight of ages. Mandalorians, how delightfully primitive. Your reputation echoes across several timelines, though in most you're already extinct. I am Kang, master of the temporal stream, conqueror of infinite moments. This galaxy is now under my dominion, and your world will serve as the foundation of my new empire. Bo-Katan felt ice slide down her spine. She had faced Imperial officers and separatist droids, Sith lords and crime bosses. She knew arrogance when she heard it, but this was something else. This was certainty. The voice spoke of conquest, not as ambition but as historical fact, as though their defeat was something he had already witnessed. "This is Mandalorian space," she replied, her voice steady. "Leave now, or we will defend it." Laughter, dry as dust from a tomb. Defend? With what? Primitive rocket fuel and kinetic weapons? I have fought wars across centuries, conquered civilizations that discovered principles of physics your species won't imagine for millennia. Your defiance is adorable and pointless. One of Kang's ship's weapon ports opened. Energy gathered there, not the green of turbolasers or the blue of ion cannons, but something that had no color, a void in the spectrum itself. Bo-Katan saw her sensors register the charge and simultaneously register that the charge had already been fired, temporal causality collapsing into paradox. "Break formation!" she shouted, yanking her controls hard. The beam lanced out, and where it struck, time itself died. One of her Fang fighters simply ceased to have ever existed. Not destroyed, not scattered into atoms, erased. The ship, its pilot, every action they had ever taken in the last 6 hours, unwritten from history. Bo-Katan felt the reality around the fighter's absence shimmer and seal, cause and effect reweaving to compensate for the void. She had watched friends die before, but she had never watched them become never. Evasive maneuvers, return to Sundari. Her squadron scattered, pilots whose courage had carried them through Mandalore's darkest years, now fleeing before a weapon they couldn't comprehend. Kang's ship didn't pursue. It simply hung there, victorious through inaction, its presence alone enough to prove dominion. The rupture behind it began to stabilize, edges smoothing into a permanent gateway, a scar between this galaxy and wherever Kang called home. Bo-Katan's fighter screamed back towards Sundari, her mind racing. She had faced impossible odds before and found ways to win, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy with fleets to outmaneuver or politicians to outthink. This was something that existed outside the rules, that could reach into the past and rewrite defeats into victories. She needed help. The kind of help that Mandalore's pride had always prevented them from seeking. In the royal palace's war room, clan leaders gathered, hardened warriors, strategists who had survived the Purge, veterans of the Clone Wars and the Empire's occupation. They stood around the holotable in their armor, each piece bearing clan sigils and personal modifications, their presence a testament to Mandalorian resilience. Bo-Katan transmitted the encounter, every second preserved in her fighter's records. They watched in silence as Kang's weapon erased existence itself. When the footage ended, No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Paz Vizsla, massive in his blue beskar, crossed his arms. "We've fought Jedi, Sith, the entire Imperial war machine. We survived. We always survive. By adapting," Bo-Katan countered. "By learning our enemy's strengths and finding their weaknesses. But this isn't an enemy we can learn. He controls time itself. Every battle we've already fought, he could go back and ensure we lose. Every victory in our history, he could erase." "Then what do you propose?" Koska asked. "Surrender? Information. We need to understand what we're facing before we commit to open war. That ship is still in orbit. I'm going to board it." The room erupted. Clan leaders shouted over each other, some demanding immediate assault, others counseling caution, all united in the belief that their leader walking into an enemy vessel was tactically insane. Bo-Katan let them argue for precisely 10 seconds. Then she activated the Darksaber. The black blade ignited with a crackling hum, its energy a void that seemed to drink the light around it. The room fell silent. "I am not asking permission," she said quietly. "I am informing you of my decision. If Kang wanted us dead, we would be. He wants something from Mandalore, and I will find out what. Koska, you have command until I return. If I don't return, the Darksaber passes to you. Protect the clans." She deactivated the blade and left before anyone could mount further protest. Behind her, she heard Paz mutter something about Kry's stubbornness being a curse on the planet. He wasn't wrong. Her ship cut through Mandalore's upper atmosphere, a small transport painted in clan colors, unarmed except for the warrior it carried. Bo-Katan sat in the pilot's seat, armor sealed, the Darksaber a weight of destiny at her side. She had no plan beyond proximity, no strategy except observation. In another life, she would have called this reckless, but that life had died with her sister. Kang's vessel dominated her viewport, impossible architecture casting shadows across Mandalore's daylight side. As she approached, a section of the hull phased into solidity, a docking port materializing where none had been, an invitation or a trap, possibly both. She brought her ship in with practiced precision, magnetic locks engaging with a hollow clang. The airlock equalized with a hiss. Bo-Katan drew her blasters, checked her jetpack's fuel reserves, and stepped into the unknown. The interior defied geometry. Corridors stretched in directions that shouldn't exist, walls meeting at angles that hurt to perceive. The metal beneath her boots was neither warm nor cold, existing in a state of thermal superposition. Lighting came from sources that flickered between past and future configurations, bulbs that would burn out centuries hence casting illumination now. She walked through chambers filled with technology she couldn't begin to understand. Machines that seemed to operate on their own finished products, temporal loops feeding back into themselves. Screens displayed battles from a dozen eras. Some she recognized from galactic history, others alien and strange. One showed Mandalore itself, but not as it was now. In the image, the planet bloomed green and lush, forests stretching beneath clean skies, cities built in harmony with nature rather than necessity. Old Mandalore, before the wars, before the purge. Beautiful, isn't it? Kang's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. That is your world as it could be again. I have seen 17,412 possible futures for this galaxy. In most, Mandalore remains a wasteland, your people reduced to scattered mercenaries and fading legends. But in a select few, under my guidance, Mandalore becomes the capital of a temporal empire. Your warriors become my enforcers across eternity. Your clans inherit the stars. Bo-Katan kept walking, following the voice deeper into the ship. And what does that cost us? Only your pride. Only your stubborn insistence on independence. Join me willingly, and I will restore everything your people have lost. Refuse, and I will take Mandalore anyway, but you will remember what you could have had. She emerged into a throne room, if something so vast could be called such. The chamber soared into impossible heights, architecture borrowed from cultures that had risen and fallen across time. At its center stood a dais, and upon that dais, a throne that seemed carved from crystallized temporal energy. Kang sat there, armored in technology that made her Beskar look like primitive iron. His suit bore the purple and blue of royalty earned through conquest, every plate inscribed with symbols from dead languages. The helmet that encased his head displayed a face that was both mask and window, features visible beneath transparent metal, blue eyes cold with certainty. He was studying her the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen. "Bo-Katan Kryze," he said, her name tasting like ash in his mouth. "In Timeline Sigma 7, you die defending Sundari from my initial assault. In Gamma 1-4, you survive but watch your world burn. In Delta 2-9, you kneel and become my lieutenant, enforcing my will across the outer rim. I have lived through your defiance and your submission. I know which you'll choose before you do." Bo-Katan stopped at the base of his dais, refusing to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "You know nothing. If you think Mandalorians can be conquered by threatening us with our own history, you understand nothing of our culture." "Culture?" Kang leaned forward, interest flickering across his features. "Culture is the lie the weak tell themselves to justify survival. You cling to your creed, your armor, your rituals, because you have nothing else. I offer you substance, power that transcends your petty warrior traditions. You offer slavery, I offer purpose." He rose from his throne, descending the dais with movements too fluid, as though gravity held him only by courtesy. "I have conquered worlds without number, overthrown empires that spanned galaxies. I have bent time itself to my will. And yet, I remember what it means to be limited, to fight against destiny rather than command it. Your Mandalorians interest me because you refuse to die. Century after century, catastrophe after catastrophe, you persist. That persistence could serve something greater." He stopped 3 meters from her, tall and imposing, armor humming with barely contained power. "I have technology that could restore your planet's biosphere in months. I have knowledge of temporal mechanics that would let you revisit Mandalore's golden age, learn from your ancestors, correct the mistakes that led to your downfall. I could give you the chance to save your sister." Bo-Katan's hand moved toward the darksaber before she caught herself. "What did you say?" "Duchess Satine Kryze. Died at Sundari Palace, murdered by a Sith Lord while Obi-Wan Kenobi watched helplessly. I could take you to that moment, give you the opportunity to change it. Your sister could live. You could have her back." The words landed like physical blows. Bo-Katan felt her breath catch, old grief rising fresh and sharp. She had watched Satine's funeral from the shadows, unable to show her face among the mourners, their last conversation still echoing with accusations and disappointment. The weight of that failure was a wound that had never healed. "You're lying," she said, but her voice betrayed her doubt. "I never lie. I have no need. Time bends to my will, and I could give you what you most desire. All I ask in return is loyalty. Your clans, your warriors, your world, not as slaves, but as partners in building an empire that will never fall because it exists in every moment simultaneously." Bo-Katan closed her eyes, forcing down the surge of desperate hope. She thought of Satine, of the sister who had chosen peace and paid for it with her life. She thought of the Mandalore Satine had dreamed of, pacifist and prosperous, undone by violence it refused to prepare for. And she thought of the Mandalore she herself had helped forge, hardened by loss but unbroken, rising from ashes through sheer refusal to surrender. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady. "My sister made her choice. She died believing in something greater than personal survival. If you think I would betray her memory by undoing that sacrifice, you understand nothing. Not about Mandalore, not about family, not about what makes us more than the sum of our defeats." Kang studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his features. "Timeline Delta 2-9 then. You survive the initial offer but refuse. We proceed to the conflict phase. Pity. It would have been cleaner the other way." His hand moved in a gesture too fast to track, and reality lurched. The throne room dissolved, replaced by the interior of Bo-Katan's ship, her vessel already in flight, Kang's ship receding behind her. She gasped, gripping the controls, memory fragmenting. Had she left, or had he sent her away? The temporal displacement made it impossible to tell. But she remembered his words, the threat implicit in prophecy. "This is Bo-Katan to Sundari Command," she said, her voice tight. "Prepare for war." Across the galaxy, far from Mandalore's frozen wastes, the Force shuddered. Every Jedi temple still standing felt the disturbance simultaneously, a wrongness that set teeth on edge and made the air taste of copper. In meditation chambers and training halls, Padawans cried out, severed momentarily from the cosmic current that flowed through all living things. Masters reached for lightsabers without conscious thought, muscle memory responding to a threat they couldn't name. On Coruscant, in the ruins of what had been the Grand Temple, now repurposed as an Imperial command center, Darth Vader felt it too. He stood alone in the central chamber, where once thousands had meditated, seeking wisdom in the Force's infinite depths. The chamber was dark now, stripped of its sacred purpose, filled with tactical displays and command stations. Stormtroopers worked at their posts, oblivious to the Force's cry, their small minds incapable of touching the deeper currents. But Vader heard. And in hearing, he understood. Something had entered the galaxy that should not exist. Something that touched the Force not as user or servant, but as intruder. A foreign element introduced into an ecosystem, disrupting balances older than stars. His breathing, mechanical and steady through his life support systems, quickened slightly. Rage stirred beneath the surface of his control, that furnace of fury that sustained him when nothing else could. And beneath the rage, something else, something he refused to acknowledge but could never quite extinguish. Fear, not for himself. He had died to fear on Mustafar, burned away all weakness in volcanic fire. But fear for the stability of the galaxy itself, for the empire he had helped forge, for the order imposed through strength. Chaos had destroyed the Republic. Chaos had birthed the rebellion. And now something touched the Force in a way that suggested chaos given form and purpose. Lord Vader. A controller approached with proper deference, stopping precisely 4.3 meters away, the distance Vader's reputation demanded. "We've received reports of gravitational distortions in the Mandalore sector. Imperial garrison has gone dark. Show me," Vader commanded, his voice distorted by his mask into something inhuman. The holographic display materialized, tactical data streaming in from scattered outposts. Mandalore had never been fully integrated into the Empire, its people too proud, too dangerous, their guerrilla tactics too effective. Garrison forces monitored rather than occupied, a light presence meant to observe more than control. Every one of those garrisons now reported the same phenomena. Temporal anomalies, equipment failures, personnel experiencing memories of events that hadn't occurred, and at the center of it all, a vessel of unknown origin broadcasting a simple message in every language simultaneously. "This galaxy is under new management. Resistance is futile. Compliance will be rewarded. Those who oppose will be unmade." Vader's gloved hand clenched into a fist, leather creaking. "Prepare my ship. I will investigate personally. My lord, Admiral Piet, suggests we send a fleet to..." The controller's words died as Vader's rage manifested physically, Force pressure descending like a hammer. The man gasped, clutching his throat, not because Vader was strangling him yet, but because the dark side's presence made the air itself hard to breathe. "I will go personally." Each word delivered with mechanical precision, devoid of inflection yet dripping with threat. The controller fled. Stormtroopers cleared a path as Vader strode from the chamber, his cape billowing behind him like a shadow given weight. He had felt something similar once before, long ago, when he was different and bore a different name. On Mortis, where the Force itself took form as gods playing out eternal conflict. The father, the daughter, the son, balance, light and dark, made manifest. That encounter had nearly broken him, had shown him truths about destiny and choice that he still did not fully understand. And now, the Force cried out again, wounded by something that operated outside its laws. He would find this intruder, and he would end it. Mandalore had 3 days before Kang's true assault began, 3 days that Bo-Katan used to turn Sundari into a fortress, to recall every clan member scattered across the sector, to forge her disparate warriors into something resembling a unified defense force. The Mandalorians had always been raiders, guerrilla fighters, masters of mobility and individual combat. Pitched defense was against their nature, but they learned. Because they had to. Fortifications rose around the domed cities. Shield generators salvaged from Imperial wrecks powered up for the first time in years. Heavy weapons emplacements appeared on every rooftop, every balcony, every vantage point that could provide overlapping fields of fire. The Mandalorians brought out weapons cached since the Clone Wars, since the Old Republic, since ages when their people had been conquerors rather than survivors. And Bo-Katan drilled them mercilessly, not in traditional Mandalorian tactics, but in something she had learned from watching the Republic's clone forces: coordinated fire, defensive postures, fallback positions and kill zones. It grated against every warrior instinct her people possessed, but they trusted her. She had earned that trust in blood. On the 3rd day, Kang's ship moved. It descended slowly, inexorably, a mountain of impossible technology settling into a stable orbit directly above Sundari. Smaller craft emerged from its hull, vessels that existed in quantum superposition, here and not here simultaneously. Their presence making sensors shriek contradictory data. Bo-Katan stood on Sundari's highest platform, the darksaber unlit at her side, her helmet's tactical display feeding her information faster than she could process. Hundreds of ships. No, thousands. They occupied every possible position simultaneously, quantum probability engines letting them exist in all locations at once until observation collapsed them into singular reality. The assault began without warning. Temporal weapons lanced down from orbit, not destroying but displacing. Buildings struck by the beams simply ceased to exist in the present, phased forward or backward through time. Bo-Katan watched an entire residential dome flicker through 1,000 years in seconds. Construction, occupancy, decay, and collapse compressed into moments before the structure stabilized into ruins. "Return fire," she commanded, and Mandalorian heavy cannons roared. Projectiles and energy bolts streaked skyward, a curtain of destruction rising to meet descending doom. Most of the shots missed, targeting systems unable to lock onto enemies that existed in probability clouds. But Mandalorians had fought impossible odds before. They adjusted, firing not at where sensors said targets were, but at where instinct and experience suggested they should be. Quantum ships collapsed into singular existence as particles struck them, superposition broken by observation, and Mandalorian accuracy did the rest. Ships fell from the sky burning, crashing into Mandalore's wastes in explosions that scattered debris across kilometers. But for every ship destroyed, 3 more manifested. Kang's temporal technology letting him replace losses by pulling reinforcements from alternate timelines where the battle hadn't yet begun. Bo-Katan activated her jetpack, launching from the platform to join warriors fighting in the air. Mandalorians in full Beskar swooped between buildings, their rockets and blasters finding targets that proper military forces would have missed. They fought like they always had, each warrior an individual force of chaos, coordinated only by shared purpose and cultural instinct. It wasn't enough. A temporal bomb detonated above the industrial sector. Where it struck, time became fluid. Buildings aged and rejuvenated randomly, metal rusting to dust and reforming new. Mandalorians caught in the blast experienced their lives out of sequence. Old wounds reopening before the battles that caused them, memories of the future overlaying present experience. Bo-Katan saw Koska caught in the effect, her second screaming as her armor aged centuries in seconds, Beskar pitting and corroding, the woman inside experiencing her own death decades hence. Bo-Katan dove, grabbed her, dragged her from the temporal distortion's edge. They hit the ground hard, Koska gasping, her armor still flickering between states. I saw myself dying, old, alone. On a Mandalore that doesn't exist yet. Bo-Katan, what is he doing to us? What he does to every world? Bo-Katan answered grimly. He unmakes what we are and remakes it in his image. She helped Koska up, checked her armor's integrity. The Beskar had stabilized, temporal flux subsiding, but the metal now bore scars from battles not yet fought. Around them, Sundari burned in impossible ways. Fires that aged backward, flames returning to fuel, smoke condensing into ash, destruction reversing into wholeness only to collapse into ruin again. The city existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, quantum uncertainty applied to architecture and flesh. Fall back to the palace, Bo-Katan ordered across all clan channels. Consolidate defenses, we can't fight him in open ground. Her warriors obeyed, jetpacks carrying them in coordinated retreats, covering each other's withdrawals with precise fire. They fought like heroes from ancient songs, every Mandalorian worth 10 of Kang's quantum soldiers. But songs didn't account for temporal weapons. Songs didn't prepare for enemies who could undo your victories by reaching into the past. Bo-Katan was the last to retreat, the darksaber finally igniting in her hand, its black blade a void that seemed to resist even temporal distortion. She cut through a quantum soldier that materialized too close, the ancient weapon severing whatever technology kept the warrior locked between timelines. The soldier collapsed into singular existence for just long enough to die. She reached the palace as Kang's ship descended further, its massive bulk now low enough that its shadow covered half of Sundari. Weapons ports opened across its underside, charging not with energy but with something worse. Temporal displacement cannons, large scale, shields to maximum, Bo-Katan commanded, landing in the palace courtyard where her remaining forces had gathered. 200 Mandalorians, maybe less. The survivors of the opening assault, not nearly enough. Kang's voice echoed across the city, transmitted through every remaining speaker, every comm unit, every piece of technology capable of producing sound. You fought well, better than most, but you cannot win against inevitability. I offer you one final chance. Surrender Mandalore to me, and I will restore it to glory. Refuse, and I will phase your entire world 3,000 years into the past. You and everyone you know will watch your culture rise and fall, powerless to change it, ghosts witnessing your own history. Bo-Katan looked at her warriors, exhausted, wounded, defiant to their cause. These were Mandalorians. They did not kneel. We are Mandalore, she said simply. And Mandalore does not surrender. She felt the collective agreement ripple through her forces. Helmets nodded, weapons reloaded. They would fight until the end, because that was the only choice their culture, their creed, their very souls could accept. Kang's temporal cannons fired, and the world shattered into fragments of probability, each piece experiencing different moments simultaneously, Sundari becoming a mosaic of its own history, past, present, and future, bleeding together into chaos. Bo-Katan felt herself fragment with it, her consciousness splitting across timelines, experiencing infinite variations of this moment. In one, she died immediately, vaporized. In another, she survived but lost everyone she loved. In a third, she never came to Mandalore at all, died young in the Clone Wars, her sister surviving instead. But in this timeline, the one she clung to with desperate will, she felt something else pierce the chaos. Something massive and terrible and focused with singular purpose. A ship emerged from hyperspace directly above Kang's vessel. No, not a ship. A superstar destroyer. The Executor, its wedge-shaped bulk materializing like doom made manifest, and from it a single presence in the Force, dark and vast and absolutely furious. Darth Vader had arrived. The Sith Lord came in a boarding pod launched at impossible velocity, augmented by Force telekinesis that made the tiny craft move like a missile. It struck Kang's hull with precision, breaching the phased armor through sheer, overwhelming impact. Vader emerged from the wreckage in a storm of dark side fury, lightsaber ignited, red blade cutting through quantum soldiers before they could collapse into singular existence. Kang felt the intrusion immediately. In his throne room, monitoring the assault on Sundari, he paused. A smile touched his lips beneath his helmet. Interesting. The local mysticism has taken notice. He rose from his throne, temporal energy crackling around his armored form. Let's see how the Force handles someone who exists outside its laws. Vader moved through Kang's ship like inevitability given form. Corridors collapsed around him, temporal weapons discharging, but the dark side protected its servant. The Force bent in defiance of the alterations Kang's technology attempted to impose, causality reasserting itself through sheer metaphysical stubbornness. Quantum soldiers manifested to block his path. Vader didn't slow. His lightsaber wove patterns of death, red blades severing men from probability itself. Where his power touched them, they died not just in this timeline but in all timelines simultaneously, causality collapsing backward and forward from the moment of his strike. He was not fighting with mere skill. He was fighting with hate, that furnace of the dark side that gave him strength when flesh would have failed. Every step carried the weight of his fury, every breath through his respirator a promise of destruction. He found Kang in the throne room, the Conqueror waiting with the patience of one who had witnessed this confrontation across multiple timelines. "Darth Vader," Kang said, tone conversational despite the circumstances. "In Timeline Alpha 3, you die here within 17 seconds. In Beta 1-2, you wound me but I escape. In Delta 3-1, we fight for 3 hours before mutual exhaustion forces a draw. I have seen every possibility. Choose which future you prefer." Vader's answer was the shriek of his lightsaber cutting air. He launched himself forward with Force-enhanced speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat, blade descending in an executioner's strike. Kang raised his hand. A temporal barrier materialized, frozen time given tangible form. Vader's blade struck it and stopped, energy sizzling against crystallized causality. The Sith Lord pushed, pouring Force power into the strike, the dark side warring against temporal manipulation. The barrier cracked, shattered. Time fragmented around the impact, reality temporarily uncertain about what had just occurred. In that moment of quantum indecision, Vader's blade completed its arc, cutting through where Kang had been. But the Conqueror had already moved, displaced himself 3 seconds into his own future, existing briefly ahead of the present. He reappeared behind Vader, temporal energy blade manifesting in his hand, weapon forged from crystallized moments. The blade struck Vader's shoulder, cutting through armor and cybernetics. The Sith Lord roared, pain and fury mixing into a sound that transcended human or machine. He whirled, one hand outstretched, Force power erupting as telekinesis given physical weight. Kang was hurled backward, his temporal shields absorbing most of the impact, but not all. He crashed into his own throne, armor sparking. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his features. "You're stronger than expected. The Force is more substantial than I calculated. The Force is eternal," Vader intoned, advancing with implacable purpose. "Your technology is merely new, chaos facing order. You will lose, will I? I have conquered galaxies, overthrown gods. What is one broken man in a mechanical shell?" Vader's response was to gesture violently, and Kang's throne room tore itself apart. Walls buckled under telekinetic pressure, technology ripping free of mountings, temporal energy conduits rupturing and spilling chronometric radiation. The ship groaned, its reality becoming uncertain, probability engines struggling to maintain coherence against the Force's assault. Kang adapted faster than any opponent Vader had faced. Temporal bombs materialized around the Sith Lord, detonating in cascades, each explosion an attempt to phase Vader out of sync with the present. Most failed, the Force protecting its dark side champion. But some succeeded, moments of Vader's existence flickering, the Sith Lord experiencing heartbeats out of sequence. It would have killed a lesser being. But Vader's connection to the dark side transcended mere physical existence. Even displaced in time, his hate remained constant, an anchor that pulled him back to the present through sheer refusal to be erased. They clashed again, lightsaber against temporal blade, each strike a collision of opposing universal principles. Where their weapons met, reality screamed. Space fractured into quantum foam, time became suggestion rather than absolute. The Force itself recoiled from the wrongness of the interaction. You fight well for a relic, Kang admitted, parrying a strike that should have severed his arm. But you don't understand what you face. I am inevitable. I am destiny itself. I have watched empires rise and fall. I have been present at the heat death of universes. I am the constant across all variables. You are a parasite, Vader countered, his breathing harsh through his respirator. Feeding on timelines you did not create, stealing glory you did not earn. You are nothing but a scavenger dressed in Conqueror's armor. Something cold flickered in Kang's eyes. And you? What are you but a slave? To the Emperor, to your pain, to choices made by the man you used to be. You wear chains and call them strength. At least I chose my path freely. The words struck deeper than any temporal weapon. Vader felt old rage surface, memories he had tried to bury beneath layers of dark side fury, memories of sand and slavery, of a mother left behind, of promises broken and innocence burned away, memories of Padme. His control wavered for just an instant. Kang capitalized on the opening. Temporal energy lashed out, wrapping around Vader like chains, freezing the Sith Lord in a bubble of stopped time. Inside the bubble, Vader existed in a single frozen moment, unable to move, unable to act, barely able to think, as his consciousness experienced the same heartbeat infinitely. Kang approached the trapped Sith Lord, studying him with scientific curiosity. Fascinating. Even frozen in time, the Force continues to flow through you, as though it exists independent of causality. I could learn much from dissecting that connection. Perhaps your galaxy's mysticism would serve me better than I anticipated. He reached out, temporal scanners extending from his armor, beginning the process of analyzing Vader's Force sensitivity. If he could understand it, quantify it, he could replicate it, control it, add it to his arsenal of conquered powers. But Kang had made a critical miscalculation. The Force was not merely energy that flowed through living beings. It was those beings. It was the connection between all things, the web of cause and effect that bound the galaxy together. And Vader, consumed by the dark side though he was, remained part of that web. Inside his temporal prism, Vader reached out, not with his mechanical limbs, not with telekinesis or lightning or any physical manifestation of power. He reached out through the Force itself, touching the one presence in all the galaxy that knew him truly. His son, Luke Skywalker, training in exile, felt his father's call across the stars, felt the desperate fury, the trapped power, the need not for rescue but for connection. For the briefest instant, light touched dark, and in that instant, the Force reasserted itself. Vader's temporal prison shattered from within, not through brute power, but through paradox. The dark side and light side meeting within the same bloodline created a resonance Kang's technology couldn't compensate for. Time itself rejected the contradiction and simply let the Sith Lord go. Vader exploded from containment like a star going nova. Force lightning erupted from his outstretched hand, not the controlled torture he typically employed, but raw dark side fury given physical form. It struck Kang full on, searing through temporal shields, overloading probability engines, reducing quantum certainty to smoking ruin. The Conqueror screamed, armor sparking, temporal displacement failing. For the first time in millennia, Kang existed in only one place, one time, fully present and vulnerable. Vader's lightsaber took him through the chest. The blade pierced armor, flesh, and something deeper. The temporal engine that powered Kang's existence, the crystallized moment he carried in his core. It cracked under the lightsaber's energy, fissures spreading through compressed time. Kang looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then up at Vader's masked face. Impossible. I saw all the futures. You died in 70% of them. I won in the others. There was no timeline where you saw possibilities, Vader interrupted, his voice cold. The Force is certainty. You never understood the difference. He twisted the blade, and Kang's temporal core shattered completely. The effect was catastrophic. Temporal energy exploded outward. Every moment Kang had stolen, every timeline he had conquered, every alternate reality he had compressed into his armor, all of it released simultaneously. The throne room became a maelstrom of causality, history and future bleeding together, alternate versions of reality flickering into brief existence before dissolving. Vader was caught in the blast, his armor screaming warnings as temporal radiation washed over him. He felt himself fracture across timelines, experienced infinite variations of his existence. In one, he never turned to the dark side, died a hero at the height of the Clone Wars. In another, he conquered the galaxy and ruled as supreme dictator. In a third, he was never born at all, his mother dying before reaching Tatooine. But through all of it, the Force remained constant, the web that bound everything together, the connection that transcended causality. He clung to that certainty as Kang's ship began to collapse around him. The Conqueror's death had destabilized everything, temporal engines failing, quantum superpositions collapsing into singular doomed reality. The vessel was tearing itself apart, unable to exist without its master's power to hold it together. Vader ran, moving through disintegrating corridors with the Force guiding every step. Behind him, the throne room imploded, reality folding into itself, time and space becoming one final unified catastrophe. He reached his boarding pod as the ship's outer hull began to fragment, launched himself back toward the Executor through a void filled with debris and dying quantum soldiers. His pod's shields held barely, absorbing impacts that should have killed him, his own Force presence reinforcing mechanical protection. The Executor's tractor beams caught him, drawing him in as Kang's vessel entered its death spiral. The massive ship, no longer held together by temporal manipulation, collapsed according to normal physics. Sections fell into Mandalore's atmosphere, burning bright as they descended, metal returning to dust, stolen technology becoming molten rain. Vader emerged from his pod in the Executor's hangar, damaged but intact. His breathing was labored even by his standards, pain signals screaming through what remained of his nervous system. But he lived. He had won. Around him, Imperial personnel maintained proper distance and proper silence. They had learned long ago not to approach the Dark Lord uninvited. Vader walked to the observation deck, watching Kang's ship break apart. The threat was ended. The galaxy was safe from temporal manipulation. Order had been restored through application of superior force, yet he felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. The same emptiness that had consumed him since Mustafar, since Padme, since everything he had been dyed in fire. For just a moment, when his son had touched his mind across the stars, he had felt something else, something warm and terrible and utterly beyond his ability to process. Connection, the thing he had spent decades trying to destroy within himself. He pushed the feeling down, buried it beneath layers of dark side fury where it could not trouble him. On Mandalore, the temporal distortions began to fade. Buildings that had been phased into different eras snapped back to the present, some damaged, some destroyed, but real again. Mandalorians caught in time loops found themselves returned to singular experience, memories of alternate timelines fading like dreams. Bo-Katan stood in the palace courtyard, the darksaber still lit, surrounded by her surviving warriors. She had felt Kang's death through the Force disturbance, felt reality reassert itself as the Conqueror's technology failed. Above, she watched the Executor hold position in orbit, its massive bulk, a reminder that one threat had been replaced by another. Koska limped to her side, armor still bearing temporal scars. "We're getting a transmission." "Imperial, Darth Vader wants to speak with you." Bo-Katan considered refusing. She had dealt with the Empire before, knew their arrogance, their demands. But she also understood pragmatism. Vader had saved Mandalore, whether he intended to or not. That deserved acknowledgement. "Put him through," she said quietly. The hologram materialized, life-sized, Vader's mechanical form rendered in blue light. He stood with arms crossed, breathing steady, presence dominating even through projection. "Mandalorian," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You fought against an enemy beyond your understanding and survived. That demonstrates both courage and foolishness. The Empire will require a full accounting of events. You will submit all data regarding the temporal technology to Imperial Science Division immediately." Bo-Katan felt her jaw tighten. Of course, the Empire never wasted an opportunity to exert control. Those events occurred in Mandalorian space. Any technology recovered belongs to Mandalore. You presume to negotiate with the Empire. Vader's tone carried dangerous quiet. Your world survives because I intervened. That places Mandalore in my debt. You will comply or face consequences. We survived because Mandalorians fought and died defending their home, Bo-Katan countered, her own voice hard. You intervened because that ship threatened Imperial interests as much as ours. We owe you nothing. Silence stretched between them, tension crackling across the transmission. Bo-Katan waited for the threats, the displays of force power, the typical Imperial intimidation. Instead, Vader said something unexpected. You are correct. Bo-Katan blinked, caught off guard. What? You fought. You survived through your own strength. I came for my own reasons, not yours. The Empire's claim is based on presumed weakness. You have demonstrated you are not weak, therefore the claim is void. She studied his hologram, trying to read emotion from a mask and finding nothing. Why tell me this? Why not simply take what you want? Because I recognize strength when I see it. And because... He paused, a hesitation almost too brief to notice. Because cultures that fight to preserve themselves should not be casually destroyed, not when they have value. There was something in his tone, something almost like respect, or perhaps memory. Bo-Katan recalled stories of the Clone Wars, of a Jedi general who had worked alongside Mandalorian forces, who had earned their respect through honor and skill. Anakin Skywalker. Before he became this, the temporal technology is too dangerous to remain unsecured. Vader continued, I will station an Imperial science team in orbit to analyze the wreckage. You will maintain control of any technology that reaches Mandalore's surface. We will share data. Neither party will weaponize the technology without mutual agreement. It was more than Bo-Katan had hoped for, a partnership of sorts, however forced. Agreed. On one condition. Your ships stay in orbit. No Imperial forces on Mandalorian soil without invitation. Another pause. Then, acceptable. The Empire has more pressing concerns than occupying a frozen wasteland. Restore your world, Mandalorian. The galaxy needs warriors who fight for something beyond power. The transmission ended before Bo-Katan could respond. She stood in the courtyard, staring at the empty space where Vader's hologram had been. Around her, Mandalorians tended to their wounded, began the long work of repair and recovery. Sundari had been savaged, but it had survived. They had survived. That was unexpected, Koska said quietly. Yes, Bo-Katan agreed. She looked up at the Executor, at the symbol of Empire hanging over her world. But for now, it was merely watching, not occupying, not conquering. It was, in its way, a victory. She deactivated the Darksaber, its black blade collapsing back into the hilt. The weapon felt lighter somehow, as though it had judged her worthy through trial by fire. Or perhaps that was merely wishful thinking, the need to believe that she had earned the right to carry it. The next weeks brought fragile peace. Imperial science teams worked in orbit, cataloging debris, analyzing technology they only barely understood. On Mandalore's surface, Bo-Katan organized recovery efforts, directing resources with the efficiency of a lifetime warrior turned reluctant politician. The temporal effects had left scars. Not all the Mandalorians caught in time distortions had returned wholly intact. Some experienced persistent memory displacement, recalling events that hadn't happened or would never happen. Others found themselves occasionally phasing slightly out of sync with the present, existing 0.03 seconds behind or ahead of everyone else. The Mandalorians adapted. They always did. They developed protocols for those affected, ways to anchor them to the present through ritual and focus. They incorporated the quantum instability into their culture, viewing it as another form of warrior's trial. Those who had survived Kang's assault wore their temporal scars as badges of honor, and slowly, carefully, they began to study the technology. Pieces of Kang's vessel had crashed across Mandalore's surface, scattered from pole to pole. Clan salvage teams ventured out in force, recovering fragments of impossible science. Most of it was too damaged to function. Probability engines reduced to slag, temporal cores cracked beyond repair. But some pieces remained intact, humming with residual power. Bo-Katan established strict protocols. No one activated recovered technology without her direct oversight. No one attempted to replicate temporal weapons. The memory of watching her people torn apart by time itself was too fresh, too terrible. But knowledge could be extracted safely. Principles could be understood without being weaponized. She stood in a secure laboratory deep beneath Sundari, watching Mandalorian engineers work with Imperial scientists through holographic link. An unusual collaboration, born of mutual caution and grudging respect. The engineers were examining a fragment of Kang's probability engine, a device the size of a human fist that had somehow contained quantum certainty given physical form. It's based on principles we don't have names for, one of the engineers reported, a woman named Shara whose armor bore clan marks from 4 different houses. Not hyperspace mechanics, not even real space physics as we understand it. It's like someone took causality itself and reverse-engineered it into technology. Can it be replicated? Bo-Katan asked. Not with our current understanding. Maybe not ever. This requires comprehension of temporal mechanics at a level our species hasn't achieved. We'd need centuries of research just to grasp the foundation principles. On the holographic feed, an Imperial scientist nodded agreement. The Emperor's Science Division concurs. This technology is beyond current galactic capability. It would take multiple generations to develop even crude approximations. Bo-Katan felt something between relief and disappointment. Relief that such weapons wouldn't spread. Disappointment that they couldn't be understood, controlled, turned to defensive purpose. Continue analysis, she ordered, but maintain containment protocols. I want full documentation of everything we learn, shared between Imperial and Mandalorian archives. If another temporal threat emerges, we need to be prepared. She left the laboratory, ascending through Sundari's rebuilt infrastructure. The city had recovered with remarkable speed, Mandalorian efficiency and Imperial resources combining to repair damage in weeks that should have taken months. It was perhaps the one benefit of the uneasy partnership Vader had imposed. She found Koska on the palace walls, staring up at the stars. Her second's armor still bore temporal scars, metal marked by battles that existed only as quantum possibilities. But she stood strong, steady, her presence a comfort. The clans are restless, Koska reported without preamble. They want to know what happens next. Whether we're truly independent, or whether the Empire's cooperation is just delay before occupation. Tell them the truth, Bo-Katan answered. We don't know. We exist in balance between forces larger than ourselves. The Empire tolerates us because Vader respects strength. The rebellion ignores us because we haven't chosen sides. For now, that balance serves us. And when the balance shifts, then we adapt. We survive. We do what Mandalorians have always done. She looked out across Sundari, at the domed city glittering beneath Mandalore's distant sun. Our ancestors conquered half the galaxy. Then we were conquered in turn. We've been warriors, mercenaries, pariahs, legends. We persist because we refuse to be erased, even when people like Kang try to erase us from time itself, especially then. Bo-Katan smiled, a rare expression that softened her scarred features. He thought he could unmake us by controlling our history. He didn't understand that we're not defined by our past, we're defined by our refusal to accept defeat. That exists outside time. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 warriors who had survived the impossible. Around them, Sundari lived and breathed, its people carrying on with stubborn determination. Markets reopened, children played in streets that had been battlefields. Life reasserted itself because surrender was not in the Mandalorian vocabulary. Months passed. The temporal distortions faded to memory, though that memory remained sharp. The executor departed Mandalore's orbit, recalled to other duties, though a small Imperial science station remained in the system, studying debris and maintaining the fragile accord Vader had established. Bo-Katan ruled with steady hand, her authority no longer questioned. The Darksaber had accepted her through trial by fire and temporal chaos. The clans followed not from obligation but from respect, earned in the most fundamental way possible. She had led them against a threat they couldn't comprehend and brought them through alive. She often thought about what Kang had shown her. The timeline where Satine lived, where Mandalore bloomed green and prosperous. It would have been easy to accept his offer, to trade loyalty for the restoration of everything lost. Part of her would always wonder if she had made the right choice. But then she would walk Sundari's streets, would see her people rebuilding, adapting, surviving with grim humor and unbreakable will. And she would know that she had chosen correctly. Mandalore was not defined by what it had been. It was defined by what it refused to stop being. On Coruscant, in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, Darth Vader knelt before his master. Emperor Palpatine sat enthroned, ancient and terrible, yellow eyes gleaming with malevolent wisdom. The hologram flickered slightly, signal degraded by distance and the dark side's interference, but the presence behind it was unmistakable. Pure, concentrated evil, decades of Sith manipulation made flesh. "You defeated the temporal intruder," Palpatine said, voice like silk over broken glass. "The Empire is pleased. Order has been maintained." "Yes, my master," Vader intoned, head bowed. "And yet you allowed the Mandalorians to retain autonomy. You could have seized control of their world while it was weakened. Instead, you negotiated, compromised. Tell me, my apprentice, have you grown soft?" Vader felt the barb, the test hidden within the question. The Mandalorians demonstrated strength. To crush them would waste a resource. To control them through fear would breed resistance. To offer partnership maintains their usefulness while preserving imperial influence. A practical answer. But I sense something else, something you hide even from yourself. Silence. Vader's breathing was the only sound, mechanical and steady, betraying nothing. Palpatine leaned forward slightly, studying his apprentice through the Force. "You saw something when you fought the temporal manipulator, experienced multiple timelines, glimpsed possibilities. Did you see him, I wonder? The man you used to be?" "I am what I am, my master. The past is dead. Is it? Or does it linger, ghost-like, haunting the shell you inhabit?" The Emperor's smile was cruel. "Remember, Lord Vader, that you serve me because you have nothing else. No future, no hope. Only power and the dark side. Should you forget this, should you begin to dream of redemption or second chances, I will remind you of what you are, what you will always be." The hologram flickered out, leaving Vader alone in darkness. He rose slowly, joints protesting through damaged cybernetics. His master was right, of course. He was what he was, a broken thing sustained by hate, by fury, by the refusal to accept death. There was no redemption for what he had done, no forgiveness possible for the crimes he had committed. And yet, when he had been trapped in Kang's temporal prison, when he had reached out through the Force in desperation, his son had answered. Luke, the boy he had never known, who carried both his bloodline and his potential. Light born from dark, Vader walked to the observation port, staring out at Coruscant's endless cityscape. Trillions of lives, each one insignificant, each one another potential thread in the Force's tapestry. Somewhere out there, Luke trained, grew stronger, moved toward a destiny that would inevitably bring father and son into conflict. Vader looked forward to that day with something that might have been anticipation, or perhaps dread. The emotions had become difficult to distinguish, buried beneath so much anger, but he knew one thing with certainty. When they met, when they finally faced each other across whatever battlefield fate chose, the Force itself would shudder. Light and dark would collide in ways that transcended simple good and evil. And in that collision, perhaps, the prophecy that had defined his existence would finally make sense. For now, he returned to duty, to serving the Empire and his master, to maintaining order through terror and overwhelming force. But in the deepest parts of his consciousness, in places even Palpatine couldn't quite reach, a tiny ember remained. Not hope, exactly. Vader had murdered hope long ago. But something else, something that had survived Mustafar, survived decades of dark side corruption, survived even the certainty that redemption was impossible. The memory of what it felt like to have a reason to fight beyond mere survival. On Mandalore, seasons changed. The planet's harsh climate remained harsh, but life adapted as it always did. New construction rose beside old ruins. Technologies salvaged from Kang's vessel were slowly, carefully integrated into defensive systems. Not the temporal weapons, those remained locked away, too dangerous to use, but the probability shields, the quantum sensors, the energy sources that defied conventional physics. Mandalore became stronger, not through conquest, but through endurance. Through the stubborn refusal to die that had defined the culture since its inception. Bo-Katan stood once more on Sundari's highest platform, the same place she had stood when Kang first descended. The dark saber hung at her hip, no longer a weight of doubt, but a symbol of earned authority. She thought about the Conqueror who had tried to rewrite her world's history, who had offered power and restoration at the cost of everything that made Mandalore meaningful. She thought about Vader, the Dark Lord, who had saved them not from mercy, but from recognition of strength. She thought about her sister, dead these many years, who had chosen peace and paid the ultimate price. And she thought about the future, unwritten, uncertain, but theirs to forge. "This is who we are," she said quietly to the wind. "Not the strongest, not the wisest, not the most righteous, but the ones who refuse to stop fighting, the ones who look at impossible odds and say, 'Not today.' That's what makes us Mandalorian." Below her, the city lived. Above her, stars wheeled in their eternal dance. And between earth and sky, a people who had been unmade and remade a dozen times across history continued their long tradition of survival. Not because destiny demanded it, not because the Force guided them, but because they chose to, every single day, with the same grim determination that had carried them through millennia of triumph and tragedy. In the end, that choice mattered more than any temporal weapon, more than any Force power, more than any empire that rose and fell across the galaxy's long history. The choice to persist, to endure, to be Mandalorian despite everything the universe could throw against them. And so they did. The story of Kang the Conqueror's invasion passed into legend, told in the great halls where clans gathered, sung by warriors over fires, preserved in the oral histories that Mandalorians valued more than any written record. It became a lesson and a warning. A lesson that power without purpose was ultimately hollow. That technology divorced from wisdom was simply another form of slavery. That true strength came not from controlling others, but from knowing oneself so thoroughly that external control became impossible. And a warning that the galaxy held threats beyond understanding, forces that existed outside the natural order, dangers that required unity to face. Years passed. The galaxy continued its tumultuous journey, the Empire tightening its grip while rebellion sparked in systems across the rim. Mandalore remained neutral, trading with both sides, fighting for neither, maintaining precarious independence through strength and reputation. Bo-Katan aged into the role she had claimed, her hair graying at the temples, scars accumulating on her face and armor. She ruled with fairness and iron will, her word law, her judgment trusted. The darksaber stayed lit in her hands, no longer flickering with uncertainty, and on quiet nights, when she walked Sundari's walls alone, she would sometimes feel the echo of temporal distortion, the faintest ripple of Kang's presence still lingering in the planet's quantum field. A reminder that the battle had been real, that the threat had been genuine, that survival had not been guaranteed. Those echoes comforted her, in a strange way. They proved that Mandalore had faced the impossible and won, that her people's strength was not myth or boast, but tested reality. She died in her sleep, years later, at an age respectable for a warrior. The darksaber passed to Cosca Reeves, who carried it with the same stubborn honor Bo-Katan had shown. And the cycle continued, as it always had, as it perhaps always would. In distant parts of the galaxy, those who had studied Kang's technology came to understand certain principles. That time was not as linear as it appeared. That causality could be manipulated, under specific circumstances, with the right tools and knowledge. Some sought to replicate his weapons. All failed. The temporal manipulation he had mastered required more than mere technology. It required a mindset that viewed history as malleable, that could hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously, that existed outside the normal flow of existence. The galaxy's inhabitants, bound by cause and effect, limited by linear perception, could not achieve that mindset. They were too entangled in the web of causality to step outside it. Only the Force remained truly transcendent, existing beyond time while simultaneously permeating it. The Jedi had understood this, in their way, speaking of future visions and past echoes. The Sith had exploited it, reaching backward to corrupt, forward to manipulate. But neither understood it fully. The Force remained mystery, even to those who wielded it. Perhaps that was appropriate. Some things should remain beyond complete understanding, beyond full control. The very attempt to master everything was itself a kind of madness, the affliction that had driven Kang across timelines, that drove Vader into deeper darkness, that doomed civilizations to collapse under their own hubris. The Mandalorians understood this instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate it in philosophical terms. They survived not by controlling their environment, but by adapting to it, not by rewriting history, but by accepting it and building something new from the ruins. That wisdom, earned through catastrophe and maintained through cultural memory, was perhaps their greatest strength, greater than their armor, their weapons, their martial prowess. The understanding that some things cannot be controlled, only endured. And in endurance, there was a kind of victory all its own. Decades after the temporal war, a young Mandalorian named Jahera discovered a fragment of Kang's vessel half buried in ice near Mandalore's northern pole. The metal was still active, still humming with residual probability energy, still flickering through quantum states despite the years. She brought it to Sundari, to the elders who maintained the archives. They studied it carefully, comparing it to fragments recovered in the war's immediate aftermath. This piece was different, more stable, almost as if it had been designed to survive, to be found. Inside its quantum core, they discovered something unexpected. Not a weapon, not a tool, a message. When activated with the correct sequence, the fragment projected a hologram. Kang appeared, rendered in blue light, his expression weary rather than arrogant. This was not the Conqueror who had threatened Mandalore. This was someone else, something else. "If you're seeing this, I am dead," the hologram said, "defeated by forces I underestimated." Good. I had grown tired of conquest, but couldn't stop. The temporal manipulation, the quantum immortality, the infinite iterations of self, it consumes you. Makes you forget why you started seeking power in the first place. He paused, and for just a moment, humanity flickered across his ancient features. I was not always what I became. Once, I was simply a man who wanted to prevent catastrophe, who saw his future consumed by war and chaos and determined to stop it. But in seeking control over destiny, I became the very catastrophe I fought against. The pattern repeats across timelines. I cannot stop it. Perhaps I never could. The hologram looked directly at whoever might be watching, across years and probability. You defeated me through cultural strength, through refusal to compromise what you are for what I offered. That is rare. Treasure it. And understand that power without identity is simply another form of death. You die by degrees until nothing remains but appetite wearing your face. The message ended. The fragment went dark, its power finally exhausted, quantum states collapsing into singular inert matter. The elders who witnessed the message debated its meaning. Some saw it as attempt at posthumous redemption, the enemy seeking forgiveness after defeat. Others viewed it as final manipulation, seeds of doubt planted in case Kang's technology was ever recovered. But Jahera, who had found the fragment, who had carried it across frozen wastes to Sundari, she understood what she had witnessed. Not redemption, not manipulation, a warning from someone who had learned too late that absolute power was absolute prison. The fragment was preserved in Mandalore's archives, alongside accounts of the temporal war. It became part of the story, the epilogue that gave context to the threat they had faced. And on quiet nights, when young Mandalorians trained in the ways of their people, when they learned to fire weapons and fly jetpacks and embody their culture's ancient creed, their instructors would sometimes tell them about Kang the Conqueror, about the man who could control time itself but could not control what mattered, who could rewrite history but could not change his nature, who commanded infinite power but remained empty inside, and the lesson was always the same. Power means nothing without purpose. Technology is useless without wisdom. Strength is hollow unless it serves something greater than itself. Be Mandalorian. Not because of what you can take from others, but because of what you refuse to surrender about yourself. In the broader galaxy, Kang's invasion became a footnote, a strange incident on a backwater world, classified by the Empire, dismissed by most as exaggeration. The true scale of the threat was understood by only a handful of beings: Vader, Palpatine, Bo-Katan, and her inner circle. They kept the secret by mutual unspoken agreement. Some knowledge was too dangerous to spread. Some threats were better forgotten than analyzed. But the temporal scars remained, subtle ripples in the Force that sensitive beings could detect if they knew where to look. Jedi in hiding would sometimes feel them, temporal echoes that suggested reality was less stable than it appeared. They would meditate on these disturbances, seeking understanding through the Force. Most found only mystery. The Force could reveal many things, but even it had limits. Some events transcended mysticism, operating on principles that existed before and beyond the Force's influence. Those events were rare, precious in their rarity. They reminded Force users, Jedi and Sith alike, that they were not omnipotent, that the galaxy held wonders and terrors beyond their comprehension. It was a humbling realization, and necessary. On Tatooine, in the deep desert far from any settlement, Luke Skywalker sat in meditation. He had been training with Obi-Wan's Force Ghost, learning the ways of the Jedi, preparing for the confrontation with the Empire that he knew approached inevitably. And sometimes, during the deepest meditations, he felt something strange, a presence that was not quite his father, not quite the Emperor, not quite anything he had experienced before. A ripple in the Force that suggested other possibilities, other timelines, other ways things might have been. He didn't understand it. Obi-Wan couldn't explain it. The phenomenon existed at the edge of perception, too subtle to grasp fully, too persistent to ignore completely. Trust in the Force, Obi-Wan advised when Luke mentioned the disturbance. But understand that the Force is part of something larger. The galaxy is older and stranger than even the Jedi suspected. There are mysteries we will never solve, questions we cannot answer. Then why sense them at all? Luke asked. Because awareness of mystery keeps us humble, prevents arrogance. The Jedi fell because we believed we understood everything. In truth, we understood only fragments. The Force showed us what we needed to see, but not all that existed. Luke absorbed this lesson, turning it over in his mind. He thought about his father, the Dark Lord who had tried to recruit him to the dark side. He thought about the destiny that seemed to pull him forward, the weight of prophecy and expectation, and he thought about choice, about the ability to shape his own future despite everything that suggested it was predetermined. That thought gave him strength. Not the strength that came from Force powers or lightsaber skill, but the strength that came from knowing that he was not merely acting out a preordained script, that his choices mattered, that he could surprise even the Force itself. Kang had tried to control destiny through technology. The Emperor tried to control it through the dark side. The Jedi had tried to serve it through faith and discipline. All had failed, in different ways. All had learned, too late or not at all, that destiny was not a thing to be controlled, only experienced, only chosen, moment by moment, through decisions made with incomplete knowledge and uncertain outcomes. Luke smiled, there in the desert where twin suns beat down mercilessly. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how his story would end, but he knew who he was, what he believed, what he fought for, and sometimes that was enough. The galaxy turned, stars burned and died, civilizations rose and fell, The Force flowed through everything, connecting it all in ways both beautiful and terrible. And on Mandalore, a people who had survived too much to list continued their ancient tradition of survival, not because they were the strongest, not because the Force protected them, not because technology gave them advantage, but because they chose to. Every day, every generation, every moment when surrender would have been easier and death would have been acceptable, they chose to be Mandalorian. To carry Beskar and honor and memory forward into an uncertain future. That choice, made collectively across centuries, was their greatest weapon. Their truest strength, the thing that neither Kang's temporal manipulation nor the Empire's might nor any other threat could break. Because it wasn't built on power, it was built on identity, on knowing exactly what you are and refusing to be anything else, no matter how appealing the alternatives might appear. In the end, that refusal saved them. Not from hardship, not from loss, but from erasure. From becoming something less than themselves in pursuit of something easier. They remained Mandalorian. Through everything, despite everything, and in a galaxy where so much changed, so much was lost, so much forgotten, that permanence of identity was itself a kind of triumph. The story of Kang the Conqueror's invasion ended not with his death, but with that triumph. With the understanding that some things cannot be conquered because they exist beyond the reach of mere power, culture, identity, purpose, will. These things, chosen and maintained through conscious effort, proved stronger than any temporal weapon, more enduring than any technology, more absolute than any empire. The Mandalorians understood this. They had always understood this, even when they couldn't articulate it. It was woven into their creed, encoded in their rituals, preserved in their stories, and it would carry them forward through whatever challenges the galaxy held, into futures they could not predict but would face with the same stubborn determination that had brought them through every other catastrophe. They were Mandalorian, nothing else mattered, nothing else needed to.